We're very happy to have Dr. Ingrid Zabel here from the Paleontological Research Institute to talk with us about climate change today. And this is part of our summer reading program for all ages, which this year's theme is Unearth a Story. And so TCPL has partnered with PRI to bring programs for all ages. I think it was last week, 2 weeks ago, we had a tour at the Museum of the Earth for adults, which was great fun. And now we have Ingrid here tonight. And if you would like information about more programs throughout the summer, please take one of these flyers on the way out. Thanks, Ingrid.
All right, thank you. Thank you. So I thought I would start out by, since I don't know your backgrounds, what you know about climate change, I thought I'd start out by talking about what's been happening to our climate and why for maybe 15, 20 minutes, and then we can spend the rest of the time talking about what we can do about it. But it's hard to know how to solve a problem if you don't know what's causing the problem. And I also want to acknowledge the Park Foundation, which supports my work on local climate change education. So we're very grateful for their support. So in terms of talking about what's been happening to our climate, I thought I'd focus just locally, even though of course it's a global issue, and kind of frame it around my life in Ithaca. So I came here in 1965. I was born in Boston, but my parents brought me here when I was just a few weeks old. So I essentially grew up in Ithaca. This is my father, Roald Hoffman, with me on his back. This is my mother, Eva Hoffman. So we're going to focus in on what's happened since I was born.
What did you say your dad's name was?
Roald Hoffman. I'm going to be showing you some data. And the data come from three sources. One is the New York State Climate Impacts Assessment that was published in 2024. So they have projections, but also information about what's already happened to our climate. And then there's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and the Northeast Regional Climate Center, which is right here at Cornell. Great source for data and information about climate. All right, so let's start talking about spring. So this is my brother and me, my mother in the background. These are the Cornell pig barns that are on Pine Tree Road. And when I was a kid, we lived very near there. You could walk down and you could see the piglets in the spring. So we would walk down and see when they were born. And you can see the way my brother and I are dressed, that it must have been early spring, or maybe it was kind of a cold spring day, because we almost look like we're dressed for winter. But let's look at what's happened to spring temperatures in Tompkins County. So I'm going to show you some data. On the vertical axis, I'll be plotting temperature in Fahrenheit. Horizontal axis, it'll be year from 1965 to last year. And it's going to be the average temperature in spring from March to May. So what does average temperature mean? Well, that means, say you take a single day, say the 1st of March, and you record lots of temperatures, and then you average those to get one average temperature for that day. And then you do the same for the next day and the next day, and for all the days in those 3 months, and then you average all of those numbers together. So you get one single average temperature. Okay, so here come the data. And you can see they fluctuate. Some springs are warmer or colder than others. But if we put on a trend line, you can see that there is a trend towards warming. So our springs are getting warmer. And it's been 0.3 of a degree Fahrenheit increase per decade. Another thing that has been seen all over the country, actually in many places in the world, is that spring is coming earlier. And I'm going to show you just a little snippet from an Instagram reel I created. So this is at the Cayuga Nature Center, and this is a sugar maple tree that we've been following now for 12 years. This is 10 years of data, I think, here, of the date when the leaf buds break open. And what you can see is that there's a trend as time has progressed towards the leaf buds breaking open earlier. Now, this is only 10 years of data. I would not draw any conclusions about if this is due to climate change until we have about 30 years of data. but it's suggestive that there's a change happening. And I'd be really interested to see, as we keep collecting data, what if this trend continues. All right, let's talk about summer. So this is me and one of my grandmothers down at Stewart Park, sitting on a bench with some cotton candy. I picture it to be sort of a pleasantly warm Ithaca summer day. And we still have many pleasantly warm summer days, but we are getting more extreme heat. So let me show you some projections. So these numbers are for the days per year where the temperature reaches above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. This is from that New York State Climate Impacts Assessment, and they calculated a baseline number, which is the average from 1981 to 2010. And during that 30-year period, on average, there were 9 days per year in this region where we have temperatures over 90. By the middle of this century, that's expected to be somewhere to 24 to 42 days per year. And by the end of the century, the 2080s, somewhere between 35 to 70 days per year where the temperature reaches above 90. I'm not happy about this. I don't like the heat. Some people love it. But it's also not just a matter of comfort, it's a health issue. So heat can make people sick. So we need to start getting ready for this. Of course, we need to try to slow this down, but we need to get ready. And luckily, Tompkins County already has things going on. So for instance, this is a map, it's actually from 3 years ago, of cooling centers in Tompkins County, including the Tompkins County Public Library. Many of these cooling centers are public libraries that are free and open to the public and have good air conditioning, but there are also buildings at Cornell and Ithaca College where people could go if they need to stay safe from the heat. And we at PRI and at the Museum of the Earth are working on becoming what we call a resilience hub, and part of that may involve opening our museum as a cooling center, but we haven't gotten there yet. All right, let's talk about rain. So climate is not just temperature. So here's a picture of my mother, my brother, and I outside. My brother has an umbrella, so it must be raining, but my mother and I don't look like we're getting too wet, so it must be just kind of a gentle rain. And, in the past, when I was a kid, we had gentle rains, we had heavy rains. We still have gentle rains and heavy rains, but we're getting more heavy rains. And the reason is, as the air heats up, warmer air can hold more water vapor. So then when the conditions are right for rain to fall, there's just more water available in the atmosphere to fall. So you get these really hard rainstorms. So what's projected to happen? Again, so this is projections for future heavy rainfalls. That is a day when there's more than 1 inch of rain per day. The baseline for our region is 5 days a year when that happens. By mid-century, that's projected to go to 6 to 8 days per year. And by the end of the century, 7 to 9 days per year. So more heavy rains. Now you might look at those numbers and think, well, that's not really a big change. Like we're going from 5 to maybe 6 to maybe 7. It's not a huge change. But the thing to remember is that even 1 day of a heavy rainstorm can be a catastrophe, right? If you've ever experienced some of the terrible floods we've had or heard about other places. So it really, that small change really does matter and could make a difference. And since I've been reflecting on the past and my childhood, I'll show a picture. This was in June 1972, 2 days of extreme rain from Hurricane Agnes. It hit Corning and Elmira worse than Ithaca, but Ithaca was still hit hard. So this is a view from near where Purity Ice Cream is now, looking down Meadow Street. This was back when Meadow Street was a two-way street. And you can see the extent of the flooding there. All right, we can't talk about Ithaca without talking about snow. So I looked in my family photo albums and I tried to find a picture of my brother and me playing in the snow, but I couldn't find one. But I have a memory, I have very clear memories of us digging these tunnels in snowdrifts, and we would climb through them when we were little. And I had wondered, are we really getting less snow than I remember we had, or is it just because I was a lot smaller that the snow seemed a lot higher? So of course I looked up the data. So now I'll show you another data set. So this is annual snowfall in inches. Again, from 1965 to 2025. This is measured at the Cornell's weather station on Game Farm Road. And here's what you see. Again, fluctuation year to year, so some years are snowier than others. But if you put in a trend line, there's a definite large decrease, so 3 inches less snow per decade since the year I was born. So I'm not just imagining it. We're getting less snow as the temperature warms. All right, so why is all this happening? So we're going to start back to some basic physics. So all objects radiate energy, and it's in the form of what we call electromagnetic radiation. You might have learned about that in school. And the type of radiation depends on the temperature of the object. So for example, the sun is very hot. It's about 6,000 degrees Celsius. It's so hot that it glows. We can see it glowing in the sky. And that tells us also that it radiates visible light, that glowing light we see most strongly. But the sun also sends out infrared light and ultraviolet light, and I'm not going to talk about what those are, except as to say that infrared light you could think of as heat. All right, the Earth is much cooler than the sun. The Earth is, on average, if you average over a whole year and over all of the space on Earth, it's about 15 degrees Celsius. So the Earth does not glow. It's not hot enough to glow visibly. But the Earth does radiate energy. Everything does, mostly infrared energy or heat. And in fact, all of us do. So you are radiating heat. I am radiating heat. And that's why something like an infrared thermometer works. You put it up to someone's forehead, and there's a detector in there that measures the infrared energy and translates that to a temperature. All right, so let's look at what's happening on the surface of the Earth. So here we have the sun, the Earth, I have the sky there. So the sun is radiating, as I said, mostly visible light, passes through our atmosphere. Some of that is reflected back out to space, but some of that energy is absorbed by the Earth, and the Earth warms up. Now the Earth can't just keep absorbing that. It would just burn up, right? So the Earth absorbs energy, but it also re-emits energy. So here, but it's infrared because the Earth is cool compared to the sun. All right, so that's what's happening at the surface, but I haven't said anything about the atmosphere. So let's put in a real atmosphere that has some gases in it. The atmosphere is mostly nitrogen, oxygen, but there are these trace gases, carbon dioxide, methane, other gases. So it turns out that visible light will just pass through those gases and not interact with them at all. Again, the Earth warms up a little bit, the Earth re-radiates infrared energy, but now those gases, they are sensitive to infrared energy. They will absorb some of it, they'll start wiggling around more quickly, and they'll re-radiate some infrared energy. And some of it will go back out to space, but some of it goes back down towards the Earth. So those gases effectively trap heat around the Earth. And they're called greenhouse gases because they trap heat, sort of similar to the way a greenhouse does. So visible light comes in and it exits, but that visible light will warm things up in the greenhouse, and that infrared energy, that heat, does not escape through the glass panes. A lot of people have never been in a greenhouse or maybe never even seen one, but most of us have been inside a car and we felt that effect when you walk into a car that's been sitting in the sun and it's hot in there. All right, so we depend on the greenhouse effect. If we did not have an atmosphere with those gases in it, the Earth would be too cold for us to live on it. So we need it. But the thing is, if we put additional greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and they build up there, well, it's just going to keep heating the atmosphere. And then the planet can get too warm for us and it can become a hazardous situation. So that's what's happening now. We're putting an excess of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And to give you a sense of what's happened historically, so this is a graph of the concentration of carbon dioxide, the most prominent greenhouse gas, in the atmosphere over time from 10,000 years ago to today. And what you see is that the concentration's pretty steady over time, 10,000 years ago, maybe going up a little, but then really rapidly shooting up. Does anybody know what happened that started this off? Industrial Revolution, right. People discovered fuels that they could burn that were extremely useful, extremely energy dense. But whenever you burn something, whether it's wood or a candle or oil, it releases carbon dioxide. So very rapid rise of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Let me zoom in on, so this is the same data set, but it's just going from the year 1800 to now. So again, carbon dioxide going up. And this is a graph over that same time period of our use of coal and oil and natural gas and what we call fossil fuels, because they come from the fossilized remains of mostly plants and ocean plants and land plants. Okay, so carbon dioxide's going up, fossil fuel consumption's going up, and temperature's going up. The temperature line starts at 1850 instead of 1800 because I don't have data going back to 1800. This is global data now. This is not just Ithaca. So you might look at that and say, well, that's pretty convincing. Carbon dioxide's going up. It's because we're burning more fossil fuels. Temperature's going up. But you could say, well, that's just correlation between those graphs. It doesn't prove that fossil fuels are causing it. But it turns out there is proof. There's chemical evidence in the atmosphere. It's almost like a fingerprint of fossil fuels. And I don't have time to go into that, though we do have a video on our YouTube channel that explains that. If you're interested in chemistry, it has to do with studying carbon isotopes. So there is proof that fossil fuels are the main cause of the buildup of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. So we need to do something to reduce our use of fossil fuels. And because this affects all of us, these changes in temperature and rainfall and snowfall, they affect farming and water and people's livelihoods. So the question is, what can we do? And I guess I wanted to stop here, and before I kind of launch into talking about lots of solutions, just ask you all, what solutions do you already know about, and do you have any questions about them? Yes?
Well, I'm eating low on the food chain, I know that's one.
So eating more plants than meat? Yep. Yeah, and I have some data I can show on that, definitely. That it turns out to be very impactful, surprisingly, I thought, when I first learned about it. Anybody else?
Switch to solar.
Switch to solar energy, yep. That fuel, that sunlight is always there, and there's no greenhouse gases generated from using it. You could say maybe, well, we have to industrially use some greenhouse gases in the production of solar panels, but of course we have to do that for fossil fuel infrastructure too. And maybe as we build out more renewable energy, we can start powering those solar panel factories with solar energy or wind energy. So, yeah. Any other thoughts? Or yeah.
Walking or using public transportation.
Yes. Possible? Yeah, and in Ithaca, we have made great strides, and in New York State, I'll show you some data too, at least upstate New York, in what I would call decarbonizing our electricity. So our electricity here is very low in fossil fuel use, but in Ithaca, the biggest and sort of toughest nut to crack has been transportation. Now, I'm trying to get people to use electric vehicles or just generally not drive as much, use public transportation, walk, bike. It's tough to bike in our hilly city, but a lot of people do it. I'm always inspired by these people I see biking up the hills. Any other things you've thought of or just questions you have about solutions you've heard of?
Maybe making buildings a bit more energy efficient everywhere we live and where we work, because I feel like there's so much energy that goes into the atmosphere in terms of heating and cooling down.
Right.
Because the buildings are not isolated properly. So.
It's always cold at my bedroom.
Yeah, I mean, making better heating and cooling systems is very important, and energy efficiency. If you think about it, even renewable energy, solar, wind, if you build it at large scale, it has some detrimental environmental impact, right? So there's sort of, a colleague of mine says there's no such thing as a free megawatt. So what could we do? The best thing to do would be to use less energy. Then we're doing less harm, whatever the energy source is. All right. Well, I'm going to just start showing you some examples, a little bit of background, and then we can, but at any time, please raise your hand if you want to ask a question or just say something. I did want to say a little bit about different types of climate actions. People generally talk about two categories. So one is mitigation, so trying to prevent the world from heating up as much, to slow it down or stop it. And the other is adaptation, or becoming resilient to it. So even if we could magically turn off all our emissions tomorrow, the world has already heated up and it's going to continue heating for a little while, even if we could magically do that, which we can't. So we have to prepare for it and learn how to live with climate change, in the short term at least. And these things are related to each other. Sometimes they can be working in tandem. So this is an example of a green roof in New York City on top of the Javits Center, this big convention center. So green roofs, they have plants on the roof. There are ones in Ithaca too. And they're an adaptation solution because as we're getting more heavy rains, the plants on these roofs will soak up water, so they'll prevent flooding, and they cool the roof, which keeps people healthier. But at the same time, they lower energy use because of that cooling, and they provide insulation, so they're also mitigating climate change. Sometimes adaptation and mitigation can be in conflict with each other, though. So an example is air conditioning. As we're getting more extreme heat, a way to keep people safe is to use more air conditioning. But if we use more air conditioning, we're using more energy, and if that comes from burning fossil fuels, then we're doing the opposite of mitigating climate change. I will say mitigation makes adaptation easier. So this is one example. Suppose these maps are from the south shore of Long Island, a town called Babylon. So suppose you were the mayor or the emergency manager of this town. In the future, what would you rather face? A situation where there's only 1 foot of sea level rise? So when there's a big storm, a 50-year storm, you are going to get some flooding in the neighborhoods. But there's still some places which are safe, like a hospital, a school that could be an evacuation center, a firehouse. They're not flooded. Or if we don't mitigate well and you get 6 feet of sea level rise, those things are flooded, and the flooding extends farther inland. So of course you'd want the easier situation, only 1 foot of sea level rise. So if we do a good job at mitigating, it's going to be easier to live with the climate change that we still have to live with. All right, so I'm going to start talking about solutions, and I'm biased because I work in climate change education, so I'll start talking about education as a solution. I know you won't be able to read that, but this is a paper that was published in 2022. It was a study at San Jose State University, and they followed students who had taken a year-long course in climate change, and then they followed up with them at least 5 years later, so a long time in the future. Not typical for these types of studies. And they found that these former students had reduced their carbon emissions by about 3 tons, carbon dioxide equivalent tons a year. And they attributed it, in surveys, they attributed it to having taken this course. So teaching people about what's going on, what they can do about it, really can make a difference. Now, of course, not everyone goes to college. Not everyone who goes to college could take a year-long course on climate change. But there are, much shorter educational sort of interventions that have been shown to work too. And I'll just put in a plug for my workplace. So the kind of climate change education that we do is we have a lot of workshops and resources for teachers. We wrote a book almost 10 years ago now called The Teacher-Friendly Guide to Climate Change, but it's really accessible to anyone. It's not just for teachers. We have exhibits at our museum. We have lots of public programs and other publications. We have a ton of online content about climate change and energy, and a lot of programs for kids and school groups. All right, if you're wondering about climate change solutions and their efficacy, a lot of people think, well, I could try this or that but what's the most impactful thing I could do? Like, is it changing your diet, or is it something else? So one place that you could go, is there's a project called Drawdown. Could you raise your hand if you've heard of Drawdown?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so quite a few of you had. And they have this tool called Drawdown Explorer, and it's a website you can go to. And here's a QR code to you can also find how-to videos of sort of how to use the Explorer, but you don't even have to watch the video. It's pretty straightforward. And they have these ranked solutions. I think right now it was 83 solutions. And again, I acknowledge that it'll be hard for you to read this, but I'm going to blow it up soon. So they have these different solutions listed here in all sorts of sectors of society. And then they have estimated the impact. So if we implemented the solution, how much could we reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And they have this range which is sort of low to high of achievability. So for instance, the first one is utility scale solar PV, that's photovoltaics. So if we build big solar farms, that can have a huge impact with an achievability of somewhere between about 9 to 11 billion tons, gigatons, that's billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. All right, so I'm going to blow that up so you can see it a little closer what the top 10 are. So the top 10, it's interesting, the top 4 are renewable energy. So utility scale solar and distributed solar, that's number 3. Distributed just means instead of having a central source like a power plant and then everyone gets energy from that, you have smaller solar installations distributed around neighborhoods, towns. Then we have wind turbines on land and offshore. But here's number 5, improved diets, your solution. And when they say improved diets, that doesn't really tell you what it is, but if you dig into it, and if you go to this website, you can click on this and then you'll find more detailed information. That basically means, like you said, eating lower in the food chain, eating less meat, more plant-based food. The next one is finding alternatives for refrigerants. So the refrigerants that we use in our air conditioners, in our cars, in our homes, in refrigerators, the compounds that are in those turn out to be very, very powerful greenhouse gases, and they persist for a long, long time, thousands of years in the atmosphere. So if you have a leak, you know, if all of a sudden your car air conditioning isn't working anymore, maybe there was a puncture and a leak and all those gases went out into the air and they're heating up the planet. So scientists and engineers are trying to find alternatives that are not as damaging. And we should all check for leaks in our systems. Improve windows and glass. This is about building energy efficiency. Reduce food loss and waste. I love this one because this is so achievable. And a lot of food loss and waste happens at the individual and household level. Like it does happen, of course, in institutions, grocery stores, restaurants, but there's a lot that happens in people's homes. So it's something we all could work on. Protecting tropical forests and mobilizing electric cars. So I'm going to talk about that last one. Turns out that this is a great place to have an electric car if you're worried about climate change. So why is that? It's because of where we get our electricity. So this is these pictures and data are from the EPA, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and they've divided the United States into these regions, which don't necessarily correspond to state boundaries. And then they've looked at the emissions of different greenhouse gases from these regions, and that's what's plotted here. So greenhouse gas emissions in pounds per megawatt hour for these regions. And this one, NY up, that's New York, upstate, that's us. We have the lowest electricity emissions in the whole country. Now, in all of New York State, and the reason is because we get a lot of energy from nuclear. There's a big nuclear power plant north of us on the south shore of Lake Ontario. and from hydropower. There's a giant hydropower facility at Niagara Falls. The rest of New York State is not so great. So this is NYCW, that's New York City and Westchester, and NYLI, that's Long Island. But here, if you run an electric car, so you're charging it with electricity that emits very few greenhouse, low amounts of greenhouse gases compared to the rest of the country. Oh, yep. Okay, let's go to food choices. I'm sorry I didn't put a QR code on this, but this is the source is it's a website called Our World in Data. And I love this website. They take data and they create graphs and other visualizations. And they made this one about greenhouse gas emissions across the food supply chain. So for different foods, and again, I'm sorry it's so small, but I'll read some of them to you. But these colors represent, on the bar graphs, represent different parts of the food supply chain. So green is land use change. So it's things like in the tropics, cutting down or burning forests to create pasture land for beef cattle. Brown is on-farm emissions, so it's from things like running machinery on a farm, fertilizer, animal feed, processing, transport, retail, packaging, and other losses that could happen along the food supply chain. And what you see, and I should say about the numbers. So these numbers are greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of food. So with the first one, if you produce 1 kilogram of beef, there are 99 kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions. That's a pretty startling number, I think. So yeah, see the top ones are mostly meat. Beef, dark chocolate is up there, sorry to say. Lamb and mutton, beef, dairy herd, coffee's up there, shrimp, fish, poultry, pork. And then down towards the bottom are grains, vegetables. So yeah, so if you're eating more plant-based food, far fewer greenhouse gas emissions. I would never tell anyone to stop eating meat because I feel like that's a very personal choice, and meat has a lot of nutrition, but maybe you could eat less meat, or maybe you don't want to eat any meat. That's up to you. The other thing I like to point out is a lot of people talk about eating local. We should eat local because then we don't have the greenhouse gas emissions from trucking and flying food in. And that's true, but it turns out it's a very small part. So if you look, transport is in red. If you look for the red bars, they're very small compared to these other components of land use change and farm. So I don't think one has to worry too much about the transportation effect. There are tons of other good reasons to eat local food. But transportation is not really the driving factor in emissions.
So what does the farm refer to?
So it's, like I said, it's things like using machinery on the farm, which, tractors which burn gasoline, but also things like fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers, which are based on fossil fuels. There could be things like in rice production, it produces methane. So just, any kind of emissions that come from the actual process of farming.
Why did they pick dark chocolate to pick on?
My guess is that comes from destruction of tropical rainforests. But I don't know, but that would be my guess. Let me look at the chart, actually. Yeah, actually, the biggest part of that is this green bar, which is land use change. I will say, too, if you find this website, and you can just Google, like, greenhouse gas emissions across the food supply chain, they also have an interactive version. You see pieces of it here where you can turn off and turn on different foods, and this is kind of fun to play with and compare them. Let's just talk about food waste a little bit, too. The statistics are really shocking. Maybe you already know this, but I didn't know it till I started researching this. So in the United States, about 1/3 of the food that is produced for people to eat is wasted. So it's it's a climate issue, but it's a moral issue too when you think of people who are hungry. But the climate part of it is that, of course, it takes energy to produce that food, and that energy often leads to emissions. So if you're wasting the food, you're just having these emissions for nothing. And then there's the other side of it, which is if you throw out food that could have been eaten and it goes into a landfill, the way it decomposes, it produces methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas. So you want to try to, if you do have leftover food, you should try to compost it if you can. That's still wasting it. Composting is still wasting it in a way, right? Because it was intended to be eaten. Though, of course, there are things like composting something you wouldn't eat, like a banana peel. Obviously, that's a good thing to do. But it's much better to compost it than to throw it in a landfill. And it's something that even little kids can be taught to not waste food, and it saves money if you don't waste it. So this is like a win-win-win solution. Yes?
I was at a school, I think it was BJM, as a sub, and they had a compost thing, but nobody was using it.
Oh.
And I don't know why, I don't know.
Yeah, so what I've seen, I've visited Boynton Middle School to do some programs, and there's a teacher there and then we've gone to the lunchroom, and she staffs the compost station, and it really helps to have a person there. It's kind of instructing the kids, encouraging them, reminding them. Maybe it was something like that. Maybe they didn't have the staff capacity to have someone managing it. I don't know. It's good they at least have it. So, yeah. All right, and these are just some statistics on what we could save. If we cut food waste in the United States in half, that would be equivalent to reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from 23 coal-fired power plants, the equivalent of the energy or emissions from energy for water and electricity from, 20 million homes? I mean, it's just staggering numbers. All right, so we talked a little bit about some of the top 10 solutions. Here I have 11 through 20. I think I'm actually going to skip that and talk to about some other solutions, but I encourage you to check this out on your own. And as I said, you can dive really deep, and they always present their methodology of how they came up with these numbers, and so on. Another tool I really like that you might want to explore comes from George Washington University, their School of Public Health. And it's called Realistic Ways You Can Fight Climate Change Today. And what it has, I've blown it up on the next page, it has these sliders. So you can choose the amount of money, time, and effort that you think you can put in, and then it'll come up with some suggestions of actions you could take. So for instance, do you think you could spend more than $1,000, or all the way down to something that you could do for free? How much time do you have? Do you have minutes, hours, days, weeks? And how much effort? Do you want something that's really easy, no sweat, medium effort, or a heavy lift? Like, what are you willing to put in? So I really like how they've organized that. Somehow it makes it feel achievable, and you can play with those and see how the results change of the different actions they suggest.
What website is that?
It's, I'll go back to it's from George Washington University. The URL is not, I put it up there, but it's not really that easy to remember. But maybe this phrase, you could search for realistic ways you can fight climate change today. If you Google that, hopefully you'll come to it. All right, I wanted to mention a program that's local. Can you raise your hand if you have heard of the idea of a carbon offset? Okay, so quite a few of you. So the idea that if you travel, and that travel generates some greenhouse emissions, you could do something to offset that, something like protecting a forest where those trees are pulling in carbon dioxide emissions. But this is my favorite carbon offset, and it's right here. I love it. So this is a Finger Lakes Climate Fund. It's run by Sustainable Finger Lakes, a local organization. And it's a regular carbon offset in the sense that you You can go to their website, you can type in your travel miles, say I flew 1,000 miles somewhere, and it'll come up with a number that you could donate. But instead of that going to, let's say, planting trees, which is a typical one, it goes to funding home energy improvements right here in our community, and especially for people who have lower incomes. So it's supporting local people, it's installing technology in people's homes that reduces their emissions. That's how it's offsetting. I just think it's such a great idea. Finger Lakes Climate Fund. Here's another way I think that you can think about solutions. So you could think, if you're not sure how to start or not sure how much effort you want to put in, you could think to yourself, what could I do in 10 minutes that would be effective? What could I do in 10 weeks? What could I do in 10 months? In 10 minutes, it's often something short like maybe just talking to someone in your family or a friend about climate change. Anyway, I think that's a useful way to think about it. I've sometimes tried that, and it's kind of motivated me. All right, a few more. I mentioned talking to someone. Many people think that just talking to others about climate change is very important, and that we have more influence than we think. So this is an example. There was a series of videos about things that kids were doing. These were 3 9-year-old girls in a town in Massachusetts. They learned that their town had a law that prohibited solar panels on public buildings, and they didn't like that. They wanted to change it. So they did some research, they went to a town meeting, they spoke up, and they tried to convince the local town council to change that law. And they succeeded. So now in this town, you can have solar panels on, town hall. Of course, that's not guaranteed to succeed, but it's, it might. And that's something I think that one can do together as a group. Any thoughts from all of you about other ways you can kind of speak up about climate change?
You could vote for politicians that understand the problem.
Yep, absolutely. This was an example, the girls was an example of speaking up to a government agency. What other kinds of organizations are in their society that we could speak to? Yeah.
Usually speak to our own employers.
Yeah, your own employers. You're probably very influential there. Mm-hmm. And then more broadly, I think, to businesses. So we are all consumers, so we have some influence. We could contact companies and say, I really like your products, but I'm not going to buy them unless you cut waste and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I don't know how much impact one person has, but if there's some kind of group effort, sometimes there are boycotts, but sometimes it doesn't have to be as drastic as a boycott. It could just be trying to influence. Petition, yeah. This is one I often use when I go to Boynton Middle School. This is another way of speaking up, is through educating others. That's something you could do in a workplace too, because in any workplace you could find ways to cut waste, be more energy efficient. But this one was in a middle school. These teenage girls decided to do an energy audit, so they learned how to do it, and they ended up convincing the administrators to take some actions that came out of the audit, and that saved over $50,000 for their school. But part of this also was educating their peers. Okay, we already talked about this. I guess I'll ask that question you could think about, has anyone ever influenced your thinking? So I'll give an example. I have a colleague who has an electric vehicle, and I don't. And he's talked about it. He's talked about how he loves this car. It's the best car he's ever had. He never has to do oil changes anymore. And it has influenced my thinking because he's my friend. I respect his opinion. So I'm already sort of, I think, predisposed to think electric cars are good. But hearing from him in a very personal way has definitely made me think, when my current car dies that I'd like to get an electric car. So I think talking about things that you do with your friends and family can have a big impact. All right, totally different kind of solution. Rain gardens. So this is this is mostly about adapting to climate change. As we're getting more and more heavy rainfalls, more flooding, how can we lessen the impact of that? So you could build a rain garden. This is one at a playground in New York City. And you can see there are all these hard surfaces where when it rains, water just runs off and it can flood the playground, flood the street. But if you plant some plants, they will absorb some of that water and help prevent flooding. Plants also take carbon dioxide out of the air, so it's a mitigation solution too. We have some lots of rain gardens in Ithaca. This is an incredible one at the Cornell Botanic Gardens. You can go see for inspiration right along their parking lot. But a rain garden doesn't have to be this big and elaborate. It could be very small. In your home, at your employer. I talk about with kids, maybe they could build a rain garden at their school. Also related, protecting forests. So we have great local organizations like the Finger Lakes Land Trust. You could volunteer with them. Forests also soak up rainwater. They cool the environment. The trees take in carbon dioxide and store it in their wood. I think it's hard for one person to protect a forest, but I think joining a group, you could have an impact. How much of an impact? So how much carbon dioxide does a tree actually take in? So it depends on the type of tree and the size. I have a little activity there that we can do at the end if you want, where turns out if you know the type of tree and you can measure its diameter, actually you have to measure the circumference and divide by pi, otherwise you'd have to cut down the tree. And we don't want to do that. So for instance, this is my colleague Alex Moore and her daughter. They have this very big old maple tree in their yard. And you could look up, that tree has taken in over 48,000 pounds of CO2 while it's been living. And as it continues to live, it'll take in more. And when it dies, if it's left to decompose, eventually that carbon will go into the soil and into the air, but for a long time, that takes a while, so it's still storing carbon for a while. And if you use the wood for something, build something out of that wood, you're locking away that carbon. Just more about trees. This is a video from 2 different neighborhoods in Baltimore, Maryland. So you see one neighborhood, and now it's transitioning to another. Which neighborhood do you think is cooler in the summer?
The wealthier one.
The wealthier one, right. And which neighborhood do you think has more trees? The wealthier one, yeah. Baltimore is an incredible study of redlining and relationship to tree canopy. But trees cool, obviously they cool with their shade. They cool urban areas. They also actually physically cool the air around the leaves through something called evapotranspiration. So urban trees are really important for protecting ourselves from extreme heat. Here's just an example of trees. I don't know if you can see the number. So this is also a street in Baltimore. This is on an August morning. In the shade of the trees, it's 84 degrees or 86 degrees. On the sidewalk in the sun, 112 degrees. 117 on the street, it's 110. So we all know this, like we feel it, but it's kind of striking to look at the numbers, like how big a difference it is. All right, transportation. We touched on this a little. That can make a big difference. So this was a study, I think it was from the US Department of Transportation, comparing people riding in cars alone versus traveling in a van pool, which is like a private bus. I once had spent a summer in Los Angeles, and the company I worked for had a van pool for its employees. So whether it's public or private, riding together reduces your emissions by a lot, in this case by about a factor of 4. Change your electricity supplier. This is something, I've presented some of these to kids, and kids can't do this. They're usually not the person in their household who decides, but you could be deciders, I'm guessing all of you. if your electricity comes from a fossil fuel source, it's a lot of emissions for a household. But you could install solar either individually on your roof or your yard, or if you can't do that, you could sign up for a community solar. Even if you rent, don't own your home, you can get community solar.
How many different options are there for community solar?
So the best, I don't know the exact answer. The best place to get that answer is Cornell Cooperative Extension. They have really knowledgeable people. But I feel like it's on the order of a handful of places in our region. Like it's probably on the order of 5 to 10, not like 50 to 100 choices. Yeah. What about small individual actions? So here's an example. We hear about turning off the lights when you leave a room. What if you turn down the thermostat a little bit, like say 1 degree Fahrenheit on a winter night? Well, that does save some carbon emissions. In this case, with this sort of an average number for the US, about 381 pounds per year. So, but that's not very big compared to other things that we're doing. So if you drive a gas-powered car, every time that car burns a gallon of gasoline, it releases 19 pounds of CO2. So you can compare 19 to 381 pretty quickly. You don't have to burn too many gallons of gas to add up to this. So are they worth it? I'm curious, what do you think? Do you think small individual actions matter, or do you think we should all focus on like big systemic change?
Do it all.
Do it all. It's interesting in the climate change education community, there's some people who really feel like we should never talk about these small actions. And there may be 100 companies around the world that are responsible for the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions. Most of them are fossil fuel companies. So we should really focus on getting them to change their ways.
You haven't spoken about the military.
No, I haven't. So the military too, yeah, certainly military actions use a lot of fossil fuels. The military, though, is also interesting. They were early on very interested in understanding climate change and trying to do something about it. A lot of it had to do with sea level rise and naval bases, which many are threatened by sea level rise. But yes, so they care about it, they want to stop it, but at the same time they're a big contributor.
But they don't have to.
Yeah,
Defund the military if we choose to.
that's right. Yeah, we could. Which gets back to speaking up and voting and political action, activism, and so on. So I'll just tell you my personal opinion about small actions. I think it's good to take them, even just turning off the light. Maybe it doesn't save that much energy, but why would you waste any energy? Like if you don't need the light on, it's just throwing away money. And I do think, especially with kids, like raising kids with that mindset of taking these actions gets kids growing up with, yeah, thank you, caring about these things. And that can, I think, lead to more action. I feel like it has for me personally. I have no data on that, but personally, I always hear my mother's voice saying, turn off the water, turn off the light, or whatever. And I think that the way my parents raised me has led to me having an environmental focus. Yes?
There are other impacts too. So if you're leaving the lights on, you're creating light pollution, which causes other problems. It's not just the CO2.
That's a really good point, yeah. Right, and I think with many of these things, yeah, there are like multiple benefits to taking the action or multiple harms to not doing it. All right, I'm mindful of the time. I think I'm gonna skip ahead. I do want to mention reuse. We have such great reuse options here in Ithaca. And I put reuse here with an exclamation point because I think reuse can be really fun too. I do a lot with kids. These are some kids at the Nature Center who made some things with objects that normally otherwise would have been thrown away or recycled. There are lots of projects for kids that they can do using old milk cartons, which now we can no longer recycle in Tompkins County, T-shirts and so on. And then there's not kids, I would say very upscale upcycling. So these are some, this was a fashion designer in Maryland who uses, reuses materials for really high fashion items. This was a college student who had made a dress out of old potato chip bags. Yeah.
Of course, you gotta eat potato chips.
Yes. Or have your friends eat them and then get their bags. So I think I'm going to end here, but just talk about, taking action as an individual or community. We touched on it a little bit. I have found it difficult. A lot of people say that the most effective type of climate action is in community and sort of at the small level, like neighborhood or town or city level. It's not to say that individual actions aren't important or larger scale, like trying to work at the federal level, aren't important, but people say that it's most effective at kind of the small scale group level. I've tried to find some research on that kind of thinking, and I haven't found it. So I don't really know if there's evidence that that's true, but a lot of people feel that that's true, or think that that's true, maybe from their personal experience. I still think the individual actions are really important, and they motivate people maybe then to join with other people. But I'm curious, do any of you work with any local groups that do climate action or other things? And how do you find that in terms of being effective?
Friendship Donation Network.
Mm. Yeah. And that would be hard to do as an individual, right? Because I imagine you need trucks and things like that to move the food, and yeah. Plus it's just more fun working with other people. It keeps you motivated. Well, thank you. I hope you found some interesting ideas. Please don't hesitate to contact me. There's my last slide. Going back to my pictures of my childhood, that was one of my favorite places in Ithaca was Andrews Candy Store. That's a picture of Mrs. Andrews. I don't know if any of you remember that. Maybe you're too young. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you.